Professor Sanbonmatsu, can you hear me? We can start a little earlier, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
yes, sorry, I can hear you.
Yeah,
So
nice
we're
to
gonna
meet
we're
you.
gonna start now?
Yeah, we can start now.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
So do you have any PowerPoint slides?
I do not.
Okay. So, nice to meet you. Uh, Thank you very much for being here. And so we're really happy to welcome you here. And also we can see and hear you brilliantly. And I should say that we're really sorry that you didn't receive emails from us with a Zoom link and other important information earlier. We still don't understand what the problem is. So we are really sorry for that. Um, so let me introduce you. John Sanbonmatsu is a associate professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, United States, where he teaches courses on ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of technology, philosophy of film, among other topics. He is also of the forthcoming book, The Omnivore Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and the Nature of Moral Life. New York University Press, publication planned for 2025. He's also editor of the book Critical Theory and Animal Liberation and author of the Postmodern Prince, Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of a New Political Subject. John is a critic of cellular or cultivated meat technology, and he curates the website. Yeah, I guess. Uh, I guess I share the link of this website in the Zoom chat. So John will give a presentation on the topic Rethinking Totality and Totalitarianism in Human Domination. As I've already said at the beginning, we share with you John's abstract, which we translated for you to better understand the Professor Sanbonmatsu's topic, and I share it with you in the Zoom chat as well. So, Professor, the floor is yours. You can start.
Thank you very much, Mark and Ian. I'm honored to be here. I'm sorry I don't speak Russian, just want to say. So I appreciate the opportunity. It took a lot of courage to pull this together and hard work. So I'm very grateful. I also want to say that I'm speaking here today in solidarity with the peoples of Ukraine and Gaza. Um, I'm going to be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and I'm going to be speaking quickly. So if you're not a native English speaker, unfortunately, it's going to be hard to follow me, but I will make the paper available. I'm going to begin with well, after a short introduction, I'm going to begin with some excerpts from my book coming out next year to situate the total and I argue totalitarian nature of the animal system. And I'm going to make the case for a return, as it were, to totality as a governing concept in social analysis. And I think this is important if we are to avoid reifying the totality in animal praxis. So now I begin. In the opening paragraph of Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer write, Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. Now, we all know at this conference that the calamity consists of overlapping and mutually amplifying crises across economy, culture, society, and finally ecology. We see the dispossession and crushing exploitation of billions of humans by capital. We see a world reduced to suffering, war, and inequality. Now, within this triumphant calamity, of course, the animals of the earth, of our planet, suffer the most, and in numbers that we literally cannot comprehend or imagine. And it's clear that this system is a total system, and again, a totalitarian system. And if we were to try to map it in its entirety we would see that it encompasses every square meter of the Earth. The animal system as a totality, I believe, was already immanent within the concept of dominion and the very ability of human beings to conceive themselves as a discrete species, unlike other species, thus creating its double in the non-human other. Nearly 3,000 years ago, obviously in Genesis, God instructs Adam and Eve, quote, to replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the other animals, an injunction God later repeats after the flood when he tells Moses, quote, that the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every fowl of the air and upon all that moveth upon the earth. In the 10th century, a group of Islamic scholars known as the Brethren of Purity in what's now Basra, Iraq, wrote an epistle called The Case of the Animals versus Man before the King of the Jinn. Fascinating story in which the animals of the earth send representatives one by one to the court of the King of the Genies, the Jinn, to complain about their oppression and enslavement by the human race. Animals who had once, quote, roamed the woodlands and wilds unhindered in search of pasture, water, and all their needs were now checked and trammeled. Gazelles and birds who had long lived in peace and quietude in their ancestral lands were forced to flee humans in terror, abandoning, quote, the haunts of men for far-off forests, wastes, mountain peaks, and glens, unquote. Yet the humans, nonetheless, set after them with all sorts of devices for hunting, trapping, and snaring, convinced that the animals were their runaway or rebellious slaves, unquote. This is in the 10th century. Furthermore, the animals describe, quote, the exhausting toil and drudgery of hauling, plowing, drawing water, turning mills, and being ridden. And they note they never consented to this usage, but were, quote, forced to these tasks with beatings, bludgeonings, and every kind of duress, torture, and chastisement throughout their lives. So again, we find already within the idea of dominion a conceptual totality that imagines humans not only as a collective subject, but as a political sovereign whose kingdom stretches across the earth. But a truly total system of violence, totalitarian surveillance, control and extermination of other beings only becomes practicable, only becomes possible in the era of monopoly capitalism, and with it the emergence of the modern state, and alongside and with it new possibilities of techno-scientific controls over human and non-human populations. As we all know, Marx and Engels spoke of capitalism as a revolutionary force that continually destabilizes and undermines all social conditions. All that is solid melts into air and so forth. Now, today, that system has resulted in what John Bellamy Foster, the eco-socialist Marxist theorist, calls a metabolic rift between the human species and the biotic order. So the system has basically become incompatible with the conditions of life on Earth, and we've entered a historical period, I would argue, of chaos, in which we're kind of hurtling through history at the speed of light, without any means to slow our rate of acceleration. So we're speaking of two systems, speciesism, or human supremacy, and capitalism, which have become essentially a double helix encoding the end of terrestrial life. You can think of it as a double helix. The human species has effectively transformed the Earth, the entirety of the Earth, into a gulag, our gulag and killing floor. We kill an estimated 70 billion land animals and up to 3 trillion sea animals every year. And to effect this slaughter, we've extended across the surface of the globe a network of controls for breeding, surveying, and exterminating our fellow creatures. Half the Earth's entire land surface is devoted to agriculture, and 80% of that is devoted either to rearing animals for slaughter or growing monocrops to feed them in order to kill them. This makes the animal agriculture system alone the most extensive cultural artifact ever produced by Homo sapiens. I mean, it's even a larger artifact, cultural artifact, than our cities and roadways and so on. Meanwhile, the majority of the Earth's animals are captives, at least vertebrates are captives. By biomass, only 4% of mammals, excluding humans, live freely in nature, and only about 30% of birds. So that means 70% of all avians, all birds on the Earth, are prisoners living out wretched, abbreviated lives in the poultry industry. Meanwhile, so nature as it existed, I should say, for countless millions of years as a boundless realm in which sensuous beings dwelled in mutual interdependence with one another, facing hardship and predation, definitely, but also joy and connection and pleasure within a realm of freedom that has ceased to exist on this planet. Meanwhile, I was going to say the greatest slaughter occurs at sea. We have millions of fishing vessels, motorized vessels, aided by sonar, GPS, computer modeling, and so forth, that set out each and every day on search and destroy missions, scouring the ocean of what little remains of conscious life. Only 3% of marine animals are thought to be free from fishing pressures. 9 out of 10 commercially exploited fish have vanished in just the last few decades in a slaughter so indiscriminate that the Fisheries Center of the University of British Columbia has compared it to, quote, wars of extermination. Now, the totalization of capital has therefore enabled the totalization of the means for controlling, surveying, and exterminating non-human life, animal life. And the way this has worked is capitalism can now only exist by incorporating all life and the means of life into its circuits and conditions of reproduction, both conditions of production and reproduction. This totality, what Hegel might have called a bad infinity, has now engulfed the entirety of the Earth and threatens imminent ecological collapse. Climate change, I could speak a great deal about the impact of climate change on other species, but I think everyone here is familiar with that. But global warming is itself merely a symptom of a wider ecological calamity. The coup de grace to animal populations who had been reeling already from centuries of human violence and capitalist depredation. The animal food economy, we now know, is the #1 most ecologically destructive force on the earth. The animal food economy, it's worse than global warming. And as a consequence of it, largely, all of the animals on the earth are dying. They're dying in the waters of the Antarctic and the Himalayas, the African savannas, the fjords of Scandinavia, in the deserts of the Kalahari and under the canopies of the Costa Rican rainforest. Since I was born, 2/3 of all extant wild animals on the earth have died. The devastation is hitting with equal apocalyptic force across the phylogenetic spectrum. Species at risk of extinction include familiar ones like rhinoceroses, hammerhead sharks, giraffes, tunas, orca whales, elephants, and so forth, and less familiar species like the Arabian oryx and the desperate leaf chameleon. The leatherback turtle, the largest seagoing turtle in the world, has seen its numbers plummet by more than 90% just in the last few decades. Population crashes of similar magnitudes have been observed in Pacific monarch butterflies, in brown bats, king penguins, even horseshoe crabs, denizens whose ancient forebears populated the seas millions of years before the dinosaurs, are suddenly approaching the brink of oblivion. Insects and other arthropods, an estimated 5 million species representing 97% of all animal life on Earth, are vanishing, destabilizing in the process the entire terrestrial food web. Not since an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, at the end of the Cretaceous period, in fact, has animal life suffered a cataclysm of remotely similar proportions. There have been 5 mass extinctions over the last 500 million years, but ours is the first to be caused by a conscious life form, our own. That we are nearing a total collapse of the ecosystem is suggested by the growing scale and frequency of what scientists term mass mortality events, in which scores of animals die all at once, often without any clear etiology. About 10 years ago, in 2013-14, hundreds of millions of starfish in the Pacific Ocean died from a mysterious wasting disease that caused their arms to shrivel and fall off, and then they dissolved into a sticky goo, a white fluid. Scientists had never seen anything like it. It was the first observed case, quote, of a continental scale collapse of a pivotal predator, unquote. Many other mass die-offs have occurred since then. Starlings in Rome collided in mid-air and plummeted to the ground a few years ago, littering the streets of the Porta Pia with thousands of their dead bodies. 200,000 saiga antelopes in Kazakhstan, more than half the species, died within mere weeks. Mass strandings and deaths of dolphins and whales have occurred in the Azov Sea, in Bali, coast of Bangladesh, Philippines, Tasmania, San Francisco, Maine. Millions of kangaroos on Australia's western plains have perished in agony from mysterious hemorrhaging disease. In 2020, the Moscow Times reported that, quote, an unexplained phenomenon, unquote, off the coast of Kamchatka had, quote, wiped out 95% of marine life, including octopuses, seals, sea urchins, and crabs, unquote. For the dying beings of the earth, the animals of the earth, it is cultural as well as biological survival that is at stake. The extermination of unique ways of life and structures of experience that have survived for millions of years. The disoriented bears wandering our city streets, the foxes and skunks sheltering under our porches, are the equivalent of displaced persons and stateless citizens, refugees from our war. Torn from the once predictable rhythms of nature and driven across a perilous landscape, fragmented by highways, feedlots, shopping malls, airports, and sprawling development, or confined in airless agony inside warehouses awaiting slaughter, the animals have become strangers in their own land. The earth is no longer their home. We have taken it from them. If asked, we would, of course, disavow any intention to eliminate other species outright. But we must ask ourselves what we do intend then when we appropriate their lands by clearing forests and damming rivers, slaying their young, burning them alive in their dens and warrens, or hauling them out of the ocean depths to be suffocated on our ships. In short, when we treat them like animals. Now, the scientific technological integration of the world, meanwhile, follows from the need of capital, quote, to settle everywhere, form connections everywhere, unquote. Artificial intelligence and the technological gestalt with its iron cage of reason is now being imposed on all life. As a consequence, it has become disconcertingly easy for us to imagine futures ethnically cleansed of animal life, yet crowded with companionate machines that supposedly behave and think like us. Like our fascination with UFOs and rumors of alien visitations, our obsession with robots and AI suggests nothing so much as malignant self-love, the narcissist's fascination with his own reflection. Love of the machine, therefore, is but the flip side of our indifference to the flesh and blood beings who live alongside us, the extraordinary beings whom we kill in mountainous heaps and discard as so much trash. In Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar, there is a telling scene of self-apotheosis in which humans traveling back in time rescue Homo sapiens from a ruined Earth through advanced technology. In the film's reimagining of Michelangelo's image of Adam reaching out to touch the hand of God, an astronaut slips through a hole in space-time to touch a spectral human hand from the future. The message of that moment is that we have met the divine and it is us. God is dead, but our machines shall make us unto gods. As beings who dwell in language, we have long found it easier to believe in the superfluidity of our imaginations than in the fixity and necessity of the natural order we evolved from and without which we cannot live. Now our technological dreams, or the fantasies of monopoly capital, have outrun our moral imaginations. Shortly before his death, the physicist Stephen Hawking added his voice to the chorus of futurists calling for our species to begin colonizing, looking around for another planet to colonize, now that we've ruined this one. We are running out of space, Hawking warned, and the only places to go to are other worlds, unquote. But such calls for colonizing other planets beyond their sheer implausibility have about them the odor of moral and spiritual obscenity. If we cannot learn to live harmoniously with other conscious life forms, let alone ourselves, we surely have no business setting up business somewhere else. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the nature of the system as totalitarian. It's a very complex topic. The topic of totalitarianism, it's a historically complex phenomenon, and in fact, very contested. What exactly it means. Very briefly, the possibility of a totalitarian state becomes possible because of monopoly capitalism, as I've said, but also because of the total nature of war. World War I was very pivotal for this. Some theorists believe that the total nature of modern warfare made possible the totalitarian state. Obviously, the animal system does not constitute a unitary state. Nonetheless, I believe it exhibits qualities of totalitarianism in its mode of organization, technologies of control, mass violence, and especially modes of legitimation. Stephen Whitefield defines totalitarianism, quote, as a dictatorial form of centralized government that regulates every aspect of state and private behavior. We might say correspondingly that speciesism is a dictatorial form of human authority and governmentality that regulates every aspect of non-human animal life, consciousness, and behavior. So in totalitarianism, of course, we have a collapse of private and public and the use of terror and violence to eliminate free consciousness. Now, there are many different ways to think about what totalitarianism is, but I always come back to George Orwell, his 1984, at the end, when George Winston is told what all this is about. He's told what the point of the totalitarian state is. And he's told, quote, picture a boot stamping on a human face forever. That is the essence of it. And if you want to see the picture or imagine the future of this planet, picture a human boot stamping on the face of the animal, the other, forever, for eternity. That is the vision we've organized our society around. Benito Mussolini, famously described fascism as a form of government in which the state is everything and the individual nothing. Was Mussolini's definition, one of his definitions. And I think this it offers us some insight into the nature of the totalitarian, which is indeed a kind of array of an objectification of or hypostasization of the state as this absolute and the individual consciousness as simply nothing. The animal system we can describe as totalitarian, first of all, in that it encompasses an absolute violence towards all manifestations of animal life, okay, including in the so-called wild. Secondly, it's totalitarian in the sense that it encompasses the totality of human society, human culture, human economy. And in fact, it has, as I've argued elsewhere, an existential component. It provides the ground for human identity. More specifically, and I'm not going to elaborate very much on this, we see, obviously, parallels with totalitarianism in the genocidal nature of human violence to other animals, dispossession, torture, mass killing, biological controls, the destruction of non-human living spaces and means of life, the intertwining of civil power with the capitalist state. So we have these enormous regimes of state, academic, agricultural, and scientific power in institutions of higher learning and so forth. The acculturation of children into vivisection and the animal food economy. We have taken control over the fundamental biology of other animals, controlling their reproductive systems, their behavior, psychologies, now at the genetic and cellular levels. Zipporah Weisberg, who will be speaking at this conference, has important on. We also see a specific relation to technology in surveillance and increasingly and disturbingly the automation of killing, the use of robots to automate slaughterhouses. We have computer chips, even on organic farms, implanted in sheep and other animals to monitor 24/7, monitor their metabolism and prepare them for being killed. And finally, we have a whole elaborate legitimation apparatus at every level of society to keep this system going, to reproduce the system, to defend against veganism and animal liberation, animal rights, and to renaturalize human domination. A big part of this is the use of language. And again, we see another parallel with totalitarianism, namely in the false reconciliation of opposites. So in Orwell, of course, we have freedom is slavery, war is peace, and so forth. We see the exact same kind of legitimation mechanism at the heart of the animal totality. I talk about this a little bit in my book. But at any rate, this is not a complete list of totalitarian aspects, and it's very important that I make clear that these phenomena are not to be seen in isolation from one another. We have to understand that these are manifestations of a unified system with a kind of coherent logic. Now, next, and this is kind of the more philosophically complicated part of what I'm going to say today. I want to talk about what I call species right. So I want to suggest that there's a particular juridical political relation that's at the basis, at the heart of animal totality, as totality. Violence against animals, that is always already legitimated through human species right, what I'm calling species right. Species right is simply the presumed political right of all humans and every human to appropriate, make use of, control, exploit, and kill any member of every other conscious being. Species right does not extend to plants per se, because plants lack consciousness. They are therefore not relational beings, and political right involves a relation of power and authority. It's relational. In the philosophy of right, elaborating on what he called, quote, the absolute right of appropriation which man has over all things, Hegel writes, all things may become man's property because man is free will and consequently is absolute, while that which stands over against him lacks this quality. Thus, everyone has the right to make his will the thing or to make the thing his will, or in other words, to destroy the thing and transform it into his own. For the thing as externality has no end in itself. It is not infinite self-relation, but something external to itself. A living being, too, an animal, and that's Hegel's word, an animal, is external to itself in this way, and therefore is so far itself a thing. Only the human will is the infinite, absolute, in contrast with everything other than itself, while that other is on its side only relative. Hegel, in this way, not only defines all non-human animals as things, and human consciousness as the absolute, he thereby also confers upon every individual human a right to dispose of the lives and bodies of non-human beings as he or she sees fit. Personhood is therefore the special province of beings who have achieved pure thought and knowledge of themselves. That is to say, beings who become conscious of and in possession of themselves. The significance which Hegel attaches to this distinction between subjects and persons becomes clear in his remarks about animals. Animals, he writes, are in possession of themselves. Their soul is in possession of their body, but they have no right to their life because they do not will it. So an animal, paradoxically, is a subject without rights. Hegel acknowledges that animals are subjects, but they're subjects without rights, and therefore they have no right to their existence. So in this seeming paradox, I suggest, lies the key to the entire ordering of violence in society, especially modern society. The liberal political order has always struggled to contain the contradiction between formal liberty and substantive unfreedom, and the same order has also struggled to systemic exclusion of subjects who are not considered full persons. So there's a distinction, right, that Hegel and Kant to some extent are drawing between the subject and the person. The significance of Hegel's crucial distinction between subjects and persons is to give ethical and juridical warrant to total domination of animals as a properly political concept. As Untermenschen, underbeings, Degraded subjects are more than things, even though Hegel calls them things, because only as inferior beings can they be hunted down, tortured, exterminated, and so forth. One cannot hunt down and kill a mere thing. Only a degraded subject will do. Giorgio Agamben, in his discussion of the sub rosa authoritarianism that is the precondition of the liberal state, observes that the sovereign is precisely he who is able to define a state of exception in which law itself can legitimately be suspended in order to protect the norm, let's say the constitutional order. What is at stake, Agamben writes, is therefore, quote, the question of the juridical significance of a sphere of action that is itself extrajudicial. Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist, argued that sovereignty is in truth nothing other than the state of exception. For the sovereign, he wrote, both stands outside of the normally valid juridical order and yet belongs to it. For it is he, the sovereign, who is responsible for deciding whether the Constitution can be suspended in toto. The sovereign, therefore, alone acts lawfully to suspend the law. In similar fashion, Hegel affirms human species right as an absolute that establishes right where there is not yet law. Human beings, as the only beings capable of nomos, of justice, are permitted to kill non-human animals justly. Agamben depicts the state of exception at the heart of sovereignty as the device that must ultimately articulate and hold together two distinct, mutually exclusive elements that constitute the state. The first is the normal and juridical, that is the formal institution of legal right. But the second is what he calls the anomic and meta-juridical, that is to say, the element of chaos and disorder which underlies the system and stands threatening always already just outside it, and which in moments of crisis requires the unilateral action or intervention of an authority to restore the norm. As Agamben notes, under normal conditions of government, such as republicanism, these elements balance one another. However, when they tend to coincide in a single person, when the state of exception in which they are bound and blurred together becomes the rule, then the juridical political system transforms itself into a killing machine. At such moments, the normative aspect of law can be obliterated and contradicted with impunity by a governmental violence that nevertheless still claims to be applying the law. Human society as such is premised on the idea of this state of exception in which the human being as sovereign reserves for itself the right to kill all other beings. By their very nature, all human juridico-political systems constitute a killing machine. And for non-human animals, the threat of totalitarian violence, therefore, is inescapable. Today, there's simply no refuge, no place of safety or refuge, however remote, where animals can escape the combined effects of industrialized development and human activity. Even the conservationists' patchwork quilt of protected wilderness areas, sanctuaries, and no-kill fishing zones, which are havens of last resort anyway, none of these offer protections that can actually protect animals. Wilderness zones cannot shield animals from a warming planet, acidification of the oceans, retinal damage from a thinning ozone layer, or long-term genetic damage caused by the millions of pounds of toxic waste, radiological agents, pharmaceuticals, and plastics dumped into the environment every year. Now, I don't know what it's like in Russia, but here millions of people donate to environmental organizations in the expectation that their money will somehow right these wrongs. If nothing else, however, the mass extinction crisis has revealed the illusory nature of these efforts, because after half a century of environmentalist lobbying and government regulation, nothing has interrupted the trajectory, which is, of course, apocalyptic. Between 1980 and 2020 in the United States, the biggest environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, National Wildlife Federation, World Wildlife Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, and so forth, these organizations added millions of members, they expanded their lobbying efforts and raised a huge amount of money. And at the same time, the planet's ecology was shutting down and all of conscious life was being wiped out. So that's the contradiction. In American military parlance, A free fire zone is a defined geographical space in which soldiers are authorized to kill at their own discretion, quote, without additional coordination with the establishing headquarters, unquote, anyone found within its bounds. This is what the Israeli state is doing in Gaza. Israel has created, free fire zones where anything that moves can be killed and will be killed. Well, this very idea was the essence of colonialism all along. Charles Mills noted, as Charles Mills noted, in marking the division of the globe and the nation into civilized and uncivilized spaces, racialization of space also marks the geographic boundary of the state's full obligations, he writes. Within the established boundaries of citizen lie safety, community, right, but outside that, insecurity, chaos, violence, and moral void. So by definition, a civil society is a space outside of which the state of nature, that is to say, a war of all against all, continues in perpetuity. And I want to just mention Dinesh Wadiwell's important book, The War on Animals. I want to recommend that. The animal question coincides with this question of space, or rather with the struggle to determine the normative boundaries between civil society and a supposed state of nature in which the use of deadly force is always already authorized. The human subject's self-authorization to constitute the spatial boundaries of violence in this way is rooted in bad faith. However, in Anti-Semite and Jew, Jean-Paul Sartre observes that the anti-Semite, quote, demands rigorous order for others, but disorder without responsibility for themselves. Okay, so in other words, we think that we live in this ordered world of moral discourse and law. In fact, we're imposing a kind of violence on all the other animals. And the reality is that our own society is disordered because of this violence, but we're refusing responsibility for it. We thus see forms of violence against, quote, invasive species or against animals whose populations are viewed as excessive, but no such violence against real estate developers, oil companies, or the general. Sartre writes of the anti-Semite, quote, he wishes to place himself above the law, at the same time escaping from the consciousness of his own liberty, unquote. The theory of the modern state develops in parallel with the shift in human consciousness initiated by Descartes and Francis Bacon, which frees human species domination of all religious and moral constraints. The word absolute means what it says. Everything is to be permitted. Reflecting the Hobbesian views of his day, Sir Walter Raleigh defined war, quote, as the state of nature of men out of community, where all have an equal right to all things, unquote. This, of course, gets taken up by Hegel, who writes that, again, that everyone has the right to make the thing, the animal, his will. Political right is affected not merely in the transition from a state of nature to that of the polity or civil society, but through the ontological transition from a subject in itself to a subject or a person for itself. By differentiating ourselves from first nature, immanent, non-conscious animal nature, we enter second nature. As I say, we become human through our life activity as self-creating beings. Murray Bookchin, the late theorist of social ecology, thus maintained that nature, including its, quote, beasts, is dumb and mute, and Bookchin insisted that while, quote, animals form communities, they do not form societies, quote unquote, because first nature, he wrote, is pre-political and pre-moral. Well, actually, that's my interpretation of him, that first nature is pre-political and pre-moral. Only second nature, human culture, manifests ontological freedom. All right, I'm sorry to go on so long. I just want to wrap up with just a little bit about the concept of totality. So I'm talking about totality in three different ways in this talk. One is the totality of the social system, right? A unified kind of structure. Secondly, I'm talking about the total aspects or the aspects of the totalitarian within this animal totality, right? And third, I'm talking about, and this is the part I want to get to, I'm talking about the concept of totality as a way of understanding all this. I can't go into the history of human views or theories of the total and the whole. But suffice it to say that Marx radicalized Hegel's conception, his dialectical conception of the totality, and that the Marxist view is holistic and not individualistic. So Marx argued that history can be seen as having a discernible objective structure, even a telos. Unlike all previous modes of production, the thing that's unique about capitalism, commodity system, is its expansionary nature, okay? That is what lends it its truly total quality. Capitalism has built into it, that is, certain economic dynamics that require it to continually transcend its own existing conditions of production, which in turn leads it to destabilize all existing social relations. Capital extends itself in space and time, and it distorts all forms of culture and consciousness. Marxists have long held that the ability of historical agents to grasp the whole of capitalist relations, that is to say, to understand the economic, political, social, cultural structure, is a necessary condition for praxis. This totality can only, however, be deciphered by historical subjects whose objective conditions place them in an epistemically advantaged position to perceive this wider structure. This is a very important point, though. If we're to understand the totality, we can't understand it in chopped up pieces. We can't understand it through a purely objective, positivist, disinterested methodology. Okay, as Martin Jay writes in his book, Marxism and Totality, which, by the way, is its own totality at 600 pages. It's an amazing book. Martin Jay writes, quote, "To know the whole was dependent for the Marxists on the existence of a collective historical subject could recognize itself in its objectifications," unquote. What does that mean? Well, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels theorized their own consciousness. They theorized the historical possibility that led to a portion of the bourgeoisie, Marx and Engels and others, to leave the bourgeoisie, at least in their commitments, and join the proletarian struggle, right? Feminist standpoint epistemologists would build on this, which just traces back to Hegel's master-slave dialectic. The point here is that the knower must be actively and materially engaged in the overcoming of existing conditions. As Antonio Gramsci wrote, only the man who wills something strongly can identify the elements necessary to the realization of his will. Now, I'm sorry, I'll try to end in 5 minutes. I'm sorry. I just want to say that there are obvious dangers to thinking about totality, because especially when we're talking about like a vanguard party in the Leninist sense, then if you have this supposedly epistemically advantaged party that has its unique grasp on totality, that can develop into authoritarianism or totalitarianism. So when I'm talking about totality, I mean it in the sense that Martin Jay describes it as, quote, adequate understanding of complex phenomena, which can only follow from an appreciation of their relational integrity, unquote. Now, Martin Jay also observes of Lenin's view of praxis, quote, as a dialectical grasp of the totality of social relations and all their concrete complexities. The theorist who thought most carefully about this, and I'm bringing it back now to the animal liberation movement, was Georg Lukács in History and Class Consciousness. And in particular, he developed this theory of reification, which is a complex topic. I can elaborate in the question period if you like, but suffice it to say that the totality of the animal system is occluded, it's covered over, mystified, and 99% of the human race has no idea that it even exists. This is so for two reasons. One, because of the ubiquity of the system, that the whole notion of totality, you can't see it because it's everywhere. Secondly, because of the presumed naturalness of human dominion, which hasn't changed. The ideological legitimation of this total system, interestingly, has barely changed since pre-modern times. There have been some minor adjustments, but basically the thing is intact from 5,000 years ago. Quite extraordinary. So in my view, totality as a conceptual apparatus is super important if we're to disocclude, as I say, to bring out into the open the totality, because we can't possibly shift human civilization away from this until people understand what it is. What gets in the way of that partly, though, is capitalist reification. Let me just read a few things from History and Class Consciousness by Lukács. He writes that because capitalism is a, quote, unified economic structure, unquote, it correspondingly generates around itself a unified structure of consciousness. The objective needs of capital require, quote, the commodity structure to penetrate society in all its aspects and to remold it in its own image, causing the structure of reification, he writes, to sink more deeply, more faithfully, and more definitively into the consciousness of man. Reification is thus the means by which, quote, every phenomenon, independently of its real and material distinctiveness, unquote, is subjected to an exact calculus. That's the definition, one definition of reification. Now, what does this mean for animal liberation? Well, cautionary word about reification. It leads to a naive empiricism rooted in the fragmentation of knowledge, such that, and I'm quoting here from a paper I wrote on effective altruism recently, a naive empiricism rooted in the fragmentation of knowledge, such that objects of cognition are viewed as discrete facts without reference to complex social geographies. It also results in a method of analysis that renders complex social problems in a purely formalistic way without deeper theoretical analysis. And what we see throughout the animal advocacy movement globally is reified forms of thought and reified forms of praxis. Lukács warns, quote, that reification leads to the destruction of every image of the whole. That is to say, by nature, capitalist reification occludes, covers over the totality of social relations. Therefore, we end up fetishizing particular facts. Now, we see this, of course, in ordinary society. For example, I'll give you two examples. Here in the United States, an elephant recently escaped a traveling circus in Montana, and the mass media reported on it very cheerfully as a kind of funny story about how the elephant was safely reunited with her abusers. So it's just a little data point that people don't understand in the context of this totality. Similarly, we have an outbreak in the United States of avian flu. It's spreading very rapidly. It's possible it will kill hundreds of millions of human beings in the coming years. But the avian flu breakout is seen as an anomaly within an otherwise well-regulated system, number one, and it's seen, of course, as a danger to humans. There's no understanding of the suffering of the other animals who are getting sick and dying and being killed. And we know from the phenomenology of perception and Gestalt psychology that a figure cannot be seen except against a background, all right? What's called the ground, perceptual ground. So if we eschew, we miss attention to totality as a structural feature of reality, then we cannot perceive the phenomena clearly or truly. We misperceive them. So our praxis must therefore be to illuminate the totality of the animal system within the larger ensemble of social relations. And just to conclude, I want to just note that Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum has this new book on animal justice. Both of them they cover over the totality of social relations. They deracinate animal oppression from these other structures like patriarchy and capitalism and so forth. And therefore, they mystify what's going on. Neither of them has a theory of the ecological crisis. And both of them, interestingly, assume human species right. So Martha Nussbaum has no problem with humans killing trillions of fish as long as they don't suffer too much. And this is kind of Singer's utilitarian ethos as well. So let me end there. Let me just say that I think that moving forward, what we need to see is in the return to a theory of totality, a work towards a synthetic theorizing that tries to grapple with this total ensemble of social relations. I want to mention in particular Marco Marizzi's excellent new book, Beyond Nature, And also Dinesh Wadiwal has a new book out called Animals and Capital that try to fill in some of the gaps and synthesize um, a theoretical approach, a new theoretical approach that would address both capitalism and speciesism. So again, I'm very sorry to speak so quickly and for so long, but if we have time for questions in English, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much for your amazing presentation, Professor Sanbonmatsu. And yeah, we hope you want to have a discussion. So, dear colleagues, are there any questions? You can write them in the chat or you can ask them aloud.
No questions. That's good. That means either that everything I said was terrible, or maybe I solved all the problems of the world, and now we know what we need to do.
So we have a question in the chat. Can you see?
It's not. I don't see a question. I see a comment.
Yeah.
Yes, I do see that. Yes, again, I apologize for speaking so quickly. I will make this talk available, in English if anyone wants to translate it later.
Yeah, and so we have a question, Zoya.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm very interested in the book when it is out, and I'm certainly going to read it. I just wanted to ask that, I don't know, I think that a lot of environmental philosophy nowadays, it is really with this very catastrophic vision and like endless melancholy. And I think that the totality or totalitarianism that you are talking about also gives this idea of absolutely no escape, or that this situation is absolutely not porous. So I would ask, where is this, where do you locate this drift or this, um, I don't know, hole in this totality, if there is any, when the situation can be subverted or changed in any way? So where is this critical point? Yes, that can give like maybe a hint of hope or a hint of subversion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. It's a great question. In 1964, Herbert Marcuse wrote his famous book, One-Dimensional Man. And what he described was the way that capitalism has functioned as a total system that now incorporates even oppositional struggle within its logic. So it's like a flattening out of human consciousness. That was 1964, okay? 4 years later, there was 1968, right? A global outpouring of radical dissent and almost revolution, certainly cultural revolution in Paris and Mexico City and Japan, in the Port Huron statement of SDS. And so that's a caution, right? That or a sign that we can't give up hope. Hegemony, by definition, always has moments of slippage, right? So that the system can be total. There was resistance even to Nazism, okay? And the Nazis, the thousand-year Reich, right, of Hitler lasted 5 years, did not last 1,000 years. Now, that said, I am not a believer in optimistic thought for its own sake. I mean, Gramsci quoted, someone will have to remind me who he quoted, but very famously, he advocated a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. In other words, we have to be sober in our analysis. And in my view, to be honest, I don't see a way out. I don't. But I can't know that. And this is Gramsci's point about will. We have to believe that it's possible to find these areas of hope. And the last thing I'll say, sorry to go on so long, is that the totality needs to be mapped in order for us to see strategic points of opportunity, strategic openings. The ecological crisis is an opening, right? Avian flu, which could kill billions of non-human animals and could kill 1 billion humans, okay? I mean, it has a lethality rate, a mortality rate, avian flu, of 52% in humans. That's an opportunity, a strategic opening, right, for us to push for an elimination of animal agriculture. So it's not, we can't, is it hopeless? I don't know, but we can't know that. So we have to at least find the courage to go forward, even if it seems very bleak.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This question is what I think a lot of us who are from Russia think a lot about this idea of
Yes.
hope and possibility inside of totalitarian situation, and it also applies to the crisis overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe, and keep up your struggle.
Yeah, thank you for the answer, Professor Sanbonmatsu. Is there any question? Yeah, Jana?
John, thank you very much for such a powerful and fascinating presentation of this topic. I'm looking forward to reading more about it. While listening to you, I was thinking about, do you apply the concept of intersectionality into your research about totality? And also, if yes, then how, if you think it's a successful strategy to use this concept? And also about total liberation, is it somehow also connected to totality? And maybe it's, if okay, we are not optimistic and we understand that actually global warming and a lot of problems cannot be returned, cannot be solved, but is there a point of total liberation where we can use the theory of totality and totalitarianism so that we can move forward this total liberation? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. So this is something Martin Jay describes in his book on Marxism and totality, that totality is an empirical concept, but it's also a normative concept, right? So in Marxist and socialist thought, the totality also refers to a new form of civilization, a new society it's based on justice and equality and and everything else. That's where the hope lies, is in thinking of in kind of utopian terms, but concretely about how to get from here to there. That's the missing part, is the strategy in there. Intersectionality is super important, but I think but it's not of itself a commitment to totality in the sense I'm talking about, because to map the totality means to be able to identify um, certain topographies of power, where power is and isn't, uh, um, how the kind of laws of economic capitalist development produce certain forms of consciousness. So intersectionality has to be part of our vocabulary, but it's not the same thing as what I'm talking about. I think it's part of that. And again, yeah, you brought up, the problem of hope. I think obviously the people who are here understand that we can't talk about the animal issue without talking about political authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, the closing of ecological possibilities. That again is why our project needs to be total, right? It's not enough to just say, well, we all have to become vegans. My friends, that is not enough, So, so I think the work to be done is to arrive and I've been arguing this for many years, to arrive at a new synthesis of movements, and not merely a coalition of movements, like, well, the anti-racist movement over here, there's the vegan movement here, and but coalescence, which in the Latin means to grow together, right? The problem is that as you know, the left is hostile to animal rights. But if we're to change things, we're going to need to create a holistic movement also. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it does. And also, I was thinking about anarchism. Is it possible that anarchism can actually kind of combine all these movements and kind of like, because anarchism is against all their hierarchies and different authoritarian regimes and speciesism, patriarchy. So what do you think? Can it be applied as a political movement and social movement that kind of is an umbrella for us?
That's a great question. I think anarchism has a number of really important insights about the nature of power and the state, but I'm skeptical that anarchism has a proper theory of praxis, and I don't think it's realistic to think that we can get rid of the state anytime in the next 200 years. We can limit the damage of the state, but I think humans, because of the contradictions in society, have become extremely aggressive and violent. And, for example, it's a problem that anarchists have to struggle with, which is, what do you do about the fact that we live under patriarchy and all women everywhere are in danger of being sexually assaulted by men? So what, we're going to do away with the state? Well, we can talk about that, self-governing communities, which there's some way to hold people accountable for criminal behavior. But criminality is not just a discourse. Criminality is a production of the capitalist cultist economic system and the state. So anyway, it's a longer conversation, but I agree that anarchism, it can be really useful for thinking about these things. But again, I'm skeptical that it can help us to think strategically, okay, about how to actually change. And see, it's not just about challenging existing institutions, and this is Antonio Gramsci's point. In other words, it's not enough to just resist and oppose things. We have to build new institutions. We have to build new forms of life. And yeah, again, anarchism can be part of that, but the anarchists I know are not very good at building institutions. So historically, There's a question in the chat by Sasha. I just want to answer that, which is that yes, that notion of transforming libido into eros is a lovely thing, and I think there's a lot in Marcuse. Zipporah Weisberg, who's going to be speaking, has done some work on Marcuse and the pleasure principle. So I think it's a really good point, and because those of us who care about animals are coming at this not only from commitment to justice, right, but a love for the other, the embrace of the sensuous part of our personalities as human beings that's spiritual and rooted in connection, and that is Marcuse's project too.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sanbonmatsu. Yeah, I have a couple comments, if you don't mind. So the ideas of Georg Lukács is also important to me. But however, his idea is need to be rethought, I guess, because if we rely on his ideas about class consciousness or reification or what else, standpoint of proletarian and commodification and so on, then we can consider animals as a working class. We have some contradictions, yeah, because animals, they okay, yeah, the animal have an advantages in perceiving the structure of capitalism, as you said, as you wrote, but also, yeah, animals cannot become aware of themselves as a class and share this awareness with other animals and, for example, go on a strike. And in this case, yeah, I guess we can only witness their resistance and stand in solidarity with other animals and yeah, with them. Yeah, but I think it's an important idea for this discourse. I mean, for the discourse of animal liberation. Yeah, and the second part of my speech is maybe you know Andreas Kalivas from New York, from New School in New York. Yeah, he has a number of interesting papers. Yeah, in one of them, he tried to distinguish between popular sovereignty and state sovereignty. And also, he writes about extraordinary democracy and extraordinary politics and so on. So yeah, and I think he give preference to the popular sovereignty, but more important, he says that popular sovereignty establish a new political order, namely new right before the law. Yeah, because it's impossible to build a new political order in the context of old law. Yeah, I think this is also an anthropocentric theory, but and because only humans in his theory can act politically. But I think that theoretical resources, yeah, can be found his papers if we consider humans not only humans, but also consider them. I mean, yeah, popular sovereignty not as humans, but consider them as totality consisting from humans and non-humans who can act politically. Yeah, because you said that I think it's correlate with your, it might correlate with your researches. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, to the point of Lukács, you're absolutely right. I mean, and Lukács later, as you know, disowned his own theory of reification to some extent. But yes, I would just, it's a longer conversation. I think there's a question of whether the proletariat, I don't think it's the object of history. We haven't seen evidence yet of that. So that remains a question. And then, as you say, non-human animals can resist, and they do resist human aggression, but not typically anyway, in a political way that would be strategic. As for Alex Kalikos' work, that sounds really interesting. I'm embarrassed I don't know about it, but I will read it. Thank you.
Yeah, I've written his name in the chat.
Andreas Kalivas. Oh, sorry,
Yes.
I misunderstood the word. Thank you.
So I guess the time is over. Thank you very much, Professor Sanbonmatsu, for your amazing presentation. And especially we are grateful for your participating in our conference. We are glad to hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you all for coming to listen, and good luck over there.
Thank you.
Thinking of you all.